Good morning, everyone, for us in the US, and good afternoon and good evening for those of you joining all over the world. I hope everyone in our global Germany for Peace community is having a great day. Welcome to this week's edition of the M&E Thursday Talks, where we aim to bring you the best and most innovative learning there is in the peace-building field and beyond. My name is Anaïs Capu. I'm a design and learning specialist at Search for Common Ground, and I'm not the usual voice, but our presenter is enjoying some time off, so I'm really delighted to be your moderator for this session today. And today we'll be focusing on the business case for optimizing program impact through embedded monitoring systems, and I'm really delighted to welcome two great guests to talk about this: John Bellish, VP of Strategy, and Lindsay Heger, Director of Impact, Learning and Accountability at One Earth Future Foundation. Many thanks to both of you for joining us today and for leading our discussion. And before jumping in, just a note, if you have a question during the webinar presentation, you can write it on the question function of the GoToWebinar dashboard, and then we'll be able to address it once we reach the Q&A portion of the webinar. So I'll now hand over to today's guests. Lindsay and John, you're very welcome, and the floor is yours.
Great, thanks so much, and thanks to you all for joining us. My name is John Bellish. I'm the Vice President of Strategy at One Earth Future. We are a private operating foundation based in Boulder, Colorado, but with offices in North America, Europe, Africa, and South America. And my colleague Lindsay Heger and I are here today and for the next 2 weeks to talk about our embedded monitoring capacity and what we've kind of learned about it over the last several years that it's been in development, and how we think that it might be relevant or applicable to other organizations in the field. Over the next 3 weeks, we're going to have three separate presentations. This first one is really about sort of making the abstract case for an embedded monitoring capacity. The next one is going to be applying that case to an example from our organization, our Paso Colombia program, which does a lot of work on excavate reincorporation and comprehensive rural economic development in Colombia. And then the third presentation is going to zero in on more of the nuts and bolts of how Lindsay and her team do this work, how we set it up, and how it really operates for those of you who are interested in that. So over the next few weeks, you'll be hearing from myself and Lindsay and a number of our other colleagues. And yeah, as I mentioned, we're really excited about this monitoring approach, something that when we were speaking to the Deeming for Peace team initially, they let us know that monitoring does not take up a large share of these presentations, which sort of makes sense, but we think that this is an exciting approach, and we hope that you agree. Before we really hop in, just want to, and I'm sure you'll hear us say this a few times, this isn't a claim that we've had this all figured out, or that we're sort of preaching this as gospel by any stretch. But we do think we've come a long enough way that we do have some insights to share, and there is evidence that this approach can be a worthwhile endeavor. So a little bit about OEF and kind of why we ended up doing monitoring the way that we do. I think there are two sort of salient facts. The first is that we've got a real diversity of peace building and peacemaking programs, running from sort of track 1.5 and track 2 negotiations through to collaborative natural resource management, security sector reform, and then more kind of grassroots peace building. So within this sort of, we needed to develop an approach that worked for that diversity of programming. The second thing that sort of is the salient point about OEF here is that we are set up as an incubator of programs. So our board and founder have said, the best use of our sort of independent resources is to engage in a structured process of trial and error to really figure out what works and what doesn't, and then partner with more traditional funders to scale that up. So that gave us really the need and then also the incentive structure to sort of invest the time and effort that we did into coming up with that approach. But now that we've done that, I mean, that's not something that necessarily other organizations in the field would have done. But now that we've done that, we feel like we're at a point where there are some sort of lessons that could be taken from the work that Lindsay and her team have done and be applied in other organizations. So with that brief intro, I'll turn it over to Lindsay, who can go into a little bit more about what Impact Learning and Evaluation, or ILA, is at OEF.
Well, thank you, John. And welcome, everybody. My name is Lindsay Heger. I'm the director of ILA. I've been at OEF for about 10 years and have experienced sort of all of the movements and program development that John was just talking about. ILA, as a department of OEF, kind of sits in this middle cluster in between all the programs, and we sit there in this kind of incubator of departments that are really intended to support and develop programs that are impactful. And our vision within that cluster is really to generate a track record of reliable analyses about impact across the myriad of programs that we have. And as John mentioned, these programs really do span the gamut, right? There are many, many different programs. And so the systems that you're going to hear about today do reflect the fact that they were developed with an eye towards being able to roll this out in many different places and many different contexts. And that's something that's crucial and sort of to bear in mind as we discuss some of those systems at a high level today. At any rate, our vision is to develop this reliable track record so that we can produce better, more impactful programming, and ultimately so that our programs that start out can scale and become larger and more impactful as they grow. Our role really is to provide the data and expertise in across sort of all MEL systems for all the programs, and to assist the programs in some of their reporting and activities with external partners when it comes to any sort of MEL activity. And so with that said, we've set up this department. Thanks, Sean. We've set up this department, and really the monitoring exercise is principally what we are engaged in on a sort of day in, day out processes. Our monitoring system is really based on 5 core tenets. They underlie our approach to pretty much every program. And at the heart of all of these is an attempt to minimize the costs associated with monitoring across many different types of peace building programs, but to maximize our ability to capture the necessary information to understand program impact and understand the conditions under which our programs can scale effectively. This first tenet, and you'll hear me refer to this both today and throughout the next couple presentations, it really does come up quite a bit, is that we develop a monitoring capacity really at our program's inception, and we staff it with full-time staff, and we do that for a number of reasons that I'll get to in just a moment. But really standing up a monitoring system based on a pretty well fleshed out or at least thought through theory of change is something that we really pride ourselves in being able to do as soon as programs sort of launch. Secondly, we focus on what we call stepped outcomes. And these are outcomes, and you'll hear this several times. Much of our effort at monitoring is focused on outcome metrics and outcome indicators. And as programs mature, we are tracking outcomes that are more and more connected to peace in the context in which they operate. And that maturation process really is reflected through these stepped outcomes where they become increasingly connected to what we think are the drivers or the causes of peace or conflict in the various places where programs are operating. This third tenet is actually incredibly important when we think about minimizing the costs. And it's that we develop our monitoring capacity in sync with program administration. Now you'll see in a few slides, and we'll talk about this a lot in our third presentation, that we develop a lot of our data collection. We embed it within how program staff, how program management administer the outputs of the program staff itself, so that we are constantly collecting data based on around those administrative processes. It reduces the cost and it reduces the time burden on our field staff. And you'll see in the third presentation how we do that and how we embed that in a couple of different administrative processes that programs here at OEF use. Fourth, we use commonly available and free or cheap tools, and we'll talk about a few of those. I'm not going to lay claim to know exactly what the right mix of those things are. There are a number of these things available, and we've certainly tried a lot of them. Sometimes it's really contextually relevant. Some particular tools are, but we have at this point, I think, kind of a stable suite of tools that we like to use, and we'll share those with you. But again, by no way do we claim that that's sort of the right way, although we have, you know, our tenet here is to focus on what is commonly available and what is pretty free or cheap. And finally, and this really is something that is quite important and really is tied to this first tenet, the first tenet about developing a monitoring capacity at program inception, and that's that we invest a lot of time up front in automation. And I'm talking about the automation processes that really work in sync with how program staff interact with the administration of a particular program, so that once program staff might report this, that, or the other thing, or might have a report from the field, right? We want to make sure that we have an automated system so that as soon as that report comes in, it shows up on a dashboard, and that program management and directors and executives at OEF are able to see in sort of as real time as possible changes on the ground from the field that are coming in as they do come in and as they're being reported. John, I'll go ahead to the next slide, please. Thanks. Okay, so the next couple slides, before we get into some of the benefits that I think we've seen from embedding such a strong emphasis on monitoring in our programs, I want to talk a little bit about where our data comes from and what are some of the principal outputs that my department produces. And for this first slide about where the data is coming from, we're kind of getting it from a lot of places, but in general, across all the programs, we have sort of four main streams of data coming in. And the first is data that the program is reporting itself. And these are, you know, data that are coming in from program staff or from staff interactions with stakeholders. This is a good proportion of what we are actually collecting through these embedded monitoring systems within the administrative sort of overlays within programs. A lot of it is coming in from Monday, and if you're familiar with Monday, it's an administrative tool, and we're generating Monday boards that basically reflect the outputs that the program is producing, and then some of the ways that the staff are interacting with, the ways that program staff are interacting with those Monday boards allows us to sort of pull that information as staff are interacting with those particular boards. Secondly, we're collecting data from the field. Usually this is in the form of survey data, surveys that are pretty regularly and frequently administered. We also do focus groups and in-depth interviews, but this is kind of a second source of a lot of our regular data. And then as many here I'm sure will know, we're collecting a lot of information from RSS feeds. And then also we track a lot of our digital analytics, both for all the social media that our programs might be engaged but also we're tracking the web pages of the programs fairly frequently and providing feedback to program staff, both on the general health of those social media or their websites, but also this sort of embedded capacity, and you'll hear about this in a few moments, allows us to very quickly answer questions about how one particular change to a website changed, say, the traffic or changed the engagement with the website. And because we've been doing this collection sort of all the way along, we can provide pretty good detail and pretty good analysis about how small changes may have big, or in some cases, no impacts whatsoever. Next slide, please, John. Thanks. All right, so with all of that information, we are producing a number of outputs. By we, I mean ILA. I've listed up here sort of the 5 things that we tend to do for all the programs fairly consistently. There are a number of other smaller things that we might do for a program that are really sort of contextually relevant and really only relevant for that program. But generally across all the programs, we're doing some assortment of these things. The first might be to produce with the program staff itself and perhaps with our communications department, pitch books, right? And these pitch books are used by the programs to talk to their stakeholders, to talk to external partners about their strategy, about their impact. And a lot of the monitoring data that we are collecting goes straight into those. Secondly, we're producing dashboards, and these dashboards are really intended for program staff and OEF executive to be able to go in and look at any given time at sort of a snapshot or a more holistic look at a program's performance whenever they want or on demand. And in our second presentation next week, we'll actually give you a demonstration of one of those dashboards, and you can see how you can see the differences in how both the program staff and how our executive interact with those, and why we've made some of the decisions that we've made about how they're designed in order to really appeal to a number of different audiences. Third, our data goes into board reports. It also goes into a lot of the website data that you can see if you pull up any of the OEF programs. There's usually a smattering, if not a whole bunch, of the data that we're gathering on a pretty regular basis on the website in order to discuss what the programs are about, to discuss their impact. And finally, we're producing what is kind of a catch-all category I'll call analytical briefs. These are, we produce a number of analytical briefs. One set of them is sort of about a quarterly snapshot look at trends that have happened in any given program using the data that we've got in order to talk to executives and program directors about, hey, these things are going really well, or hey, this may have been a misstep because it doesn't seem to be tied to the outcome that you were hoping to see. And so we use those quarterly briefs to sort of have that kind of pause, that learning moment amongst all of those individuals, so that we can all sort of step back and say, are we still headed in the right direction? Do we need to innovate a little bit more over here, or should we double down on the strategy over here because we're really seeing a lot of impact as we intended. We're also producing briefs sort of on demand. So if programs have specific questions about very particularized interventions, we're able to produce briefs that give sort of a snapshot analysis about a particular sort of moment or a particular activity. And that's really helpful principally for program management as they're deciding, how they will structure or administer particular outputs when they're in the field. Next slide, please. Thank you. So in order to, what we're getting for sort of all of this is actually a fairly significant amount of information. At present, we're collecting, and this is a snapshot as of, I believe it was about the end of June for all of the programs that we currently have. And we're collecting around 316 different indicators. Our programs are listed there, so you can kind of see by program from Scirocco down to Stable Seas, how many indicators we're collecting per program. We're also collecting a number of disaggregated data points. And these are really disaggregations of the indicators. So for example, if we are collecting something like jobs that are the results or are tied to a particular intervention, we might collect jobs that are generated for women, jobs that are generated for youth, total jobs, so on and so forth. If we're collecting things like requests for particularized expertise, we may also be tracking requests, the institutional affiliation of the requestor, or where they're from, so that we can then make a bit more sort of specific and targeted analyses in some of the outputs that we talked about just a moment ago. Now, with that, I want to say this is a lot of information. And one thing that we have learned, because we are, as John mentioned, on a path of learning in all of this, is that too much just simply isn't good. And I'll tell you, when we started this exercise several years ago, we really, the world was kind of our oyster in that we were collecting a whole bunch of information, or we set out to collect a whole bunch of information, really anything that we could think of that would be relevant and comprehensive and important. And because we were in the driver's seat, both in terms of the data collection and the programming, we really did capture quite a bit. And what we learned pretty quickly was that it was not all that useful to capture that much information. It was not useful because a lot of it said the same stuff. And it was also, and this was really the primary reason that it proved not to be useful. It wasn't useful because the program staff and the executives and even individuals in ILA could not necessarily get their head around something like 100 different data points collected at a pretty frequent, pace for any given program. It was simply too much information to really use. And so we've been going through a process of weeding out a lot of that information so that we're really only collecting the necessary information. Of all of the indicators that we are collecting, we're about 60% right now in outcome indicators. The other 40% represent some mix of both outputs, tracking outputs, and then some administrative, pardon me, indicators about how programs might get stood up or their functioning, their internal functions. But really what we've found is that programs' maturity is a pretty good predictor of whether or not we're focused more on outcomes or not, right? So for those programs that are more mature, that are scaling, that are growing, we are more likely to be tracking more and more outcomes and less likely to be tracking a lot of the outputs and the administrative indicators. And that's simply because at that point, as a foundation, we're pretty comfortable with the administration. We're pretty comfortable that the programs are producing the outputs that they're producing. What we really care about is making sure that the outcomes that we think are going to be achieved through a particular intervention are being achieved, and that's really important as the program itself starts to scale. So we see a little bit of a mix, a shift in that balance between tracking the outcomes and outputs as programs do mature. Now, one other thing I want to talk a little bit about at this point is that we see, and we're learning, again, we don't have this quite down, but we see a lot of discussions around the trade-off between validity and parsimony when it comes to collecting indicators. We really care quite a bit about making sure that, especially for peace building programs, a lot of the things that we're hoping to achieve are very, very hard conceptually to wrap our hands around empirically. And the result of that is that we have an emphasis on trying to triangulate particular conceptual changes that are related to our programming. And so if we have a program that's trying to do something, let's say around building trust or food security or whatever it is, we're going to try to triangulate with mixed methods data sources and data points around that particular concept so that we can, with pretty good certainty, say that yes, in fact, when this program did this one thing, we did see an outcome that we're pretty sure actually reflects reality. And so that, that's the validity part, right? And that's really crucial, especially in our particular sector. But the trade-off, right, has to do with parsimony and has to do with some of the issues that I spoke about a few minutes ago. If you do that too much, you end up collecting so much information that it becomes really hard to digest. And this is one of the trade-offs that we've noticed and one of the things that we have wrestled with. And as we sort of grow and as our programs scale, I think we will have more to say about how best to deal with that particular trade-off. I would say at present, where we care a lot about in kind of early programs, we're seeing, programs develop indicators around outputs and around their administration, and then picking maybe a few outcomes that they think they really should be caring about, and we'll try to triangulate data on those few outcomes so that we can be clear on whether or not they are achieving particular goals that they have set. But that after we're pretty certain that they are achieving what they hope to be achieving, we kind of back off on that triangulation a little bit, and most of the information that we collect after that point is really on things related to the scaling and the growth of some of our programs, which is another reason why we see some of our older programs with simply more indicators being collected. And that has to do with the fact that those programs are bigger, they cover sort of bigger areas, they have more interventions. Next slide, please. Okay, thanks. On this is the last slide where you'll hear me, and then I'm going to turn this back over to John. I want to just talk for a couple minutes about what I think are some of the impact-related benefits to having an embedded monitoring approach. And the first is it really provides us with the ability to identify longer-term kind of learning curves for our programs. It's not uncommon for us to see across our programs, participant excitement with particular interventions followed by participant fatigue, right? And so we kind of have seen a lot of that in our data fairly regularly, and we've kind of internalized some of the lessons from seeing those ups and downs. We're also able to use the data that we capture to set the agenda with stakeholders, with external stakeholders, around what are the best indicators to meet the expectations of that particular partnership. So when our programs sit down with stakeholders or with potential partners, they come to the table with somewhere, let's call it 50, with say 50 different data points that they've been collecting all the way up to the point of that conversation, and can say, hey, look, if we pursue this partnership, these are the types of things that we already have. And not only is that sort of a cost-effective strategy, as John will talk about in a few moments, but it also means that we can come with pretty considered information about what is the best set or one or two indicators that really will help the partnership grow and understand whether or not the partnership itself is fruitful and doing what it hopes to do. Thirdly, because we are involved in near simultaneous monitoring and administration, our program staff are interacting with administrative systems that constantly put the goals and the outcomes of the program in front of them. And I would say that this is not universally the same for every single program, but every program is kind of working in this direction. And it means that everybody at OEF who's involved in the program is kind of nearly constantly exposed to what are the goals of this program, not just what are the goals of my day, or not just what are the goals of this particular paper, this particular learning exercise, but really what are the goals of the program, and what are the beliefs and the behaviors of the stakeholders that we interact with. How do we hope that they're going to change? And we think that there's some real benefits in terms of creating unity amongst the team, creating a unified sort of effort that come as a result of marrying both the administration and the monitoring systems in the way that we've talked about today. And finally, from the program's perspective, there are data specialists on my team in ILA that are very familiar with the outcomes that the programs are hoping to achieve, with the outputs that they are producing, And these data specialists really can provide analyses on demand that are quite specialized. So there's not a big learning curve to trying to teach somebody who doesn't necessarily know the program or isn't familiar with what the program is trying to do. Rather, the program's management or the directors of the programs can turn to their ILA representative and say, hey, I need information about this, that, or the other thing. And these individuals can produce that pretty quickly and in a way that is contextually relevant and considered regarding the goals of the program. So at this point, I'm going to turn it back over to John, who's going to talk for just one more moment about how he sees or what he sees as some of the organizational benefits from the perspective of an executive at OEF.
Great, thanks, Lindsay. And obviously, OEF is a mission-driven, impact-oriented organization. So impact benefits and organizational benefits is a bit of a false dichotomy. But from my perspective, the thing that I have really appreciated about this approach, seeing it sort of come to fruition, the first is that it's cost-effective. I mean, in the last 3 to 4 years that we've had ILA, we've spent between 6.3 and 6.9% of our programmatic expenses on monitoring, evaluation, and learning, which is, I think, within the norm of what those in our field spend. And I think a lot of that sort of cost savings really does come from having full-time employees and the lower marginal cost of standing up an effort. That in addition to the kind of benefits. The next thing that I really like is it does a good job of balancing independence and integration between the ILA team and the program team. So on the one hand, you've got these separate administrative and incentive structures. So there's the integrity that you want to see sort of in between the programmatic staff and the M&E staff. But there's also that deep understanding, not only that comes from sort of the collection of longitudinal data, but also just the day in, day out partnership that the ILA team and the program teams end up entering into. That integration has a lot of benefits, both in terms of the granularity and frankly, the quality of analysis that I see. This ability to monitor both output and outcome indicators over time allows me to see things that will lead me to ask better questions than I might otherwise ask, and gives me and the program director a sort of a shared reality that we can discuss. You know, a lot of times I think it's one thing and it ends up being something else. But the fact of the matter is it draws our attention, this system draws our attention to what may or may not be genuine correlations that are sort of at least worth discussing. It also allows us to partner on evaluations at low marginal cost. So we've had a lot of success partnering with research institutions to do evaluations of our programs that they ultimately, the research institution ultimately covers the cost of. A lot of that really has to do with the fact that we've got this baseline data. Nothing that a researcher likes more than baseline data. And oftentimes we've got a number of years of baseline data that's got good validity that you can do something interesting with. So that's really helpful. And then the last one, which is the most important to me, is that having this kind of, like Lindsay said, having this in front of everybody really facilitates an organizational culture that's focused on impact in a self-honest way, allows us to have, I think, really great, respectful, challenging conversations about what's working and what isn't. And ultimately, you know, I think Lindsay was really alluding to this in her kind of how many indicators should we have discussion. It really it forces me and the program directors and the folks who are closest to the field to agree, to know, agree, and articulate what matters most. at any given time, because what matters changes over time. But having a system like this really doesn't let you get away with anything short of a really clear shared understanding of priorities, which is great from a management perspective. And it's also great from a integrating the quote unquote home office perspective versus the quote unquote field perspective. Having those conversations, having them based on data and evidence, and having it at your fingertips really has been great for us at OEF. Let me just see here. Okay, so that's it for this somewhat abstract presentation, right? This is sort of the abstract case. Next, we're going to really talk about it in practice. That conversation will be led by Juan Fernando Lucio and Andres Ciabato. Juan Fernando is the director of our PASO team, and Andres is Lindsay's colleague that works on the ILA side. So that'll be sort of the applied version of this. And with that, thank you again for your time. It looks like we've got a little bit under 30 minutes to do Q&A.
Wonderful. I think we actually end at 10:45, so it's a little shorter than that, but no problem. Thank you. This is really fascinating, and I'm sure a lot of us can't wait for next week to start kind of seeing what it looks like in practice. But thank you both. So we'll now open up the presentation for questions. So just a few notes about the format. If you're unfamiliar with the platform, as I said, you can submit your question using the dashboard and the question function and type it in there. Or you could also click on the hand icon to raise your hand, and then I'll be able to unmute you in case you want to ask your question live. And when you submit your question, we ask that you submit your name and affiliation if you like. But just so you know, this talks are recorded, and actually we had a question on that. They will be posted on our M&E for Peace website. So if you were not able to join at this time, you can go back and listen to the presentation. So I know we have a few questions, but I guess I'll be using my moderator privilege and start with one. I was really interested to hear about those quarterly briefing that you mentioned, and I think, it sounds like, in your organization, changing the culture has really been something key and something that's been working for you. But I think sometimes for us, we struggle a little bit in making sure that, all this great data that is being generated and shared through those sessions, like you mentioned, are then really actually used to transform practice. And, sometimes there's the pressure to really implement. And so we kind of agree in the session about a lot of different things and then go back to like the reality of implementing. So I would be curious to hear a little bit more from you, how you see this challenge, or what are some of the best practices in terms of really using the data you generate through the monitoring to actually transform programming practice.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. Thank you very much. Let me answer that by telling you how we messed up first, and how we think we're on the right path to fixing that. When we began producing these quarterly briefs, and I don't know if even at the beginning, if they were quarterly, they may have been even more frequent than that. We began by reporting the data. And so I have this team of folks who are trained social scientists, trained M&E experts, and they would provide these reports of all this information. And that was great in the beginning because it looked so good. And then pretty soon when we started having these conversations and questions, it became pretty evident that if we listened to the conversations and we really heard what both OEF executives and the program directors were talking about, it was maybe 30% of the information that we were providing. And they were asking a whole bunch of, well, how does data point A connect to data point B? And so just reporting the information, we concluded was not great. This is not the best way to do it. What we needed to do was to actually synthesize and provide analysis about the information. And this is where this independence and integration that John talked about is really crucial, right? We can't do a good job analyzing if we're not independent, but also integrated enough to know that to understand the contextually relevance sort of nuance in any given program. So every program has an ILA specialist who's aware of those nuances, and what their job became in the quarterly briefings was really go through all of this information and then tell us, as the expert, tell us what you see changing and give us an analysis about why you think it's important. And for for programs that are in this kind of scaling process, we really want to see whether or not there is a connection between outputs and outcomes. Really focus on whether or not we see changes that reflect, the activities of the program. And if we don't, do we see something else going on? And then as we're pretty certain that programs are achieving what we hope they're achieving, those analyses really became focused on, okay, now go and look for data that might complement some of what we have and might give us a little bit more insight to help programs scale in different places. So the quarterly briefs themselves really changed from simply reporting all this information to really providing analysis that is, written by an expert. And by an expert, I mean somebody who's well-versed both in kind of social science metrics and how to collect information, how to visualize it, but really an expert in what the programs are doing, what they're hoping to achieve, what their outcomes are, what their goals are. And look at the information and don't just give us a record of everything because that's not as useful, but really give us an analysis about how things are working, or in some cases where there are missteps, where there simply aren't connections between outputs and outcomes, because those prove to be sometimes even more useful and beneficial in terms of kind of innovating towards better impact than data that shows that we are getting the results that we hope we're getting. And John, I don't know, maybe you have some, as the executive sort of digesting all this information, maybe you have something to add there as well.
Yeah, I mean, well, just really briefly, because I would like to get one more question in. It's like reading those briefs is a non-trivial exercise. It takes a lot. Like I can't just read it. I got to read it, read some sentences a few times, take notes, and then like ask Juan or whoever about what I found. So there was a little bit of like tension, honestly, between the users and the producers at the beginning of like, hey, this is not trivial, and we really need to start to think through and iterate quickly how we do this analysis. And the ILA team did a great job of that. So there's got to be, I mean, there's no substitute for genuine buy-in from the top, from the person who's holding the program team accountable. But having the granularity and the time series and the correlation between outputs and outcomes made it worth the effort. And I think you have to get across that threshold of making it worth the effort.
Great, thank you so much. I guess we have a question from Hamid Mosla, kind of related in asking like you to talk a little bit more about how you triangulate data. And so it sounds like you have quite a robust system, but maybe if you could talk a little bit about how you collect like quantitative versus qualitative, etc.
Sure. Let me try, because I think it's a lot of what Lindsay discussed on the slide, right? There is this steady stream of who was the request, what was the nature of it, what was it for, what did there was a community dispute, how did it get resolved? There's that steady stream. Part of it is just what does the data say? Looking across data points, connecting the dots, and then the ILA team from their sort of quasi-outside perspective, raising a hypothesis. The other half of that is just good old-fashioned one-on-one check-in conversations between me and the program directors, where you sort of close that circle. And we'll speak a little more about how it works within a program team, but just kind of from my vantage point, it's that conversation of, hey, this is what the data says, this is this correlation that we think we see, what's the story? Sometimes the program director knows, sometimes they have to go to somebody who's even closer to the field to get the answer, but that's a really robust, quote unquote, data set that most people don't think of as a data set. But when you use it in this way, it really becomes a means of triangulation.
Great, thank you, that was wonderful. We have maybe time for one more. I think it's an interesting one as well, because you mentioned how you feel this is really cost effective. So Oscar Huertas is asking us, how do you calculate this cost effectiveness? And how do you also convince decision makers to invest in this type of approach? Especially, it sounds at the beginning, it can be maybe a little bit more resource intensive. So how do you deal with that?
Let me just quickly give my 2 cents, and then Lindsay from the other side. I mean, there is an initial cost. I think you need a steady stream of program funding, sort of to get the minimum viable product, I guess you could say. But once you do that, the sort of the marginal cost to the next donor, so if it's not a one-off thing, if it's a one-off 6-month contract, it's going to be difficult to make the dollars and cents kind of work. But if there's a longer stream, the upfront cost, it pays for itself pretty quickly, but you really need to be mining the data for all it's worth. You can't be spending a normal amount on external evaluations if you're doing this. You need to work to find partners that want to use your data to do that, and limit your consultant spend to like a bespoke survey that you're really just asking the questions that you need to know. So I think it's a more holistic effort, and other pieces that have to fit into place to make it cost effective overall. But it really is possible to put those pieces into place if certain conditions are met, really related to, a couple of, like a track record of being able to raise a steady stream of funding that is more or less predictable.
Great, thank you very much. And I guess we have one very quick, so I guess I'll squeeze it in, but Leanne Olayan is asking you if you could tell what program or software you're using to develop your dashboards and board reports.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So that's a good question. We actually use a number of them. There's based on sort of the program and where it is, or what it is that the programs like to see, or how they like to interact. We might use a number of different things. But right now, we're actually experiencing a bit of a sea change in that we're starting to do a lot of our dashboards in Data Studio. For a number of reasons, we're kind of Google heavy in just kind of how the program and program sort of staff interact, and so doing it there is a pretty useful place. We might also use I don't know, something. We might also use something custom that we would build that's accessible sort of offline if we have a lot of sort of field staff. But the dashboards themselves are really, where they are really reflects sort of where the program staff and where the program director and management happens to be most comfortable. And so next week, when we actually go through the PATHO demonstration, you'll see one of those dashboards, and you'll see John and Andres kind of walk through a demonstration of how it is we interact with those, and how we use particular different software to kind of pull all that information together.
Wonderful. I know, I see a few more questions we can't get to, but I think the great news is we'll be back next week, so we can continue this conversation, and I think seeing how it applies to a specific country and context and program will be really interesting. So thank you so much, John and Lindsay, and thank you everyone for joining us today. As I said, we'll be posting the recording on the M&E for Peace platform, and we also have a discussion page, so you'll be able to share comments there as well if you like. And as I said, we'll be back next Thursday, August 20th, with, as John said, advancing programmatic outcomes for monitoring, and we'll be exploring the Paso, Colombia case. So it will be the second Thursday talk in this 3-part series with One Earth Future Foundation. So we're really looking forward to it, to continue this great conversation. And yeah, if you have those questions that were not answered, then join us next week, and we'll make sure to get to that. Thank you, everyone, and I hope that you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.